A Thursday edition of Southern Fried Sports here on Tide 102.9 and 100.9 FM. The show, as always, brought to you by Mercedes-Benz of Tuscaloosa. Let's head to the Peterbrook Chocolatier studio line right now at 205-342-9904 and check in with one of our very favorite guests here on the program, a guy we haven't talked to in a little while, and that's Chris Hummer, national college football writer for 247sports.com. Chris, what you been up to, my man?
Just spring football, man. I know the world's paying attention to the NCAA basketball tournament, but just plugging away as spring football winds on. It's kind of good to have a little bit of football action out there.
I know you're a basketball guy too, though, like myself. What do you think of this Final Four? Obviously, here locally, a lot of excitement in the state with Auburn becoming the first team from the state to make a Final Four. Maybe not the star power, but what do you think for this weekend up there in Minneapolis?
I just think this is the first time in probably about a decade I've looked smart with my bracket. I still got Virginia and Michigan State alive. Yeah, so I'm pretty happy about that. And I live in Texas, so I'm pretty excited for Chris Beard and Texas Tech. Chris Beard's an awesome guy and an awesome coach. And it's kind of cool to see
lest we forget, Chris, the Longhorns of Texas tonight in that NIT final against the Bison of Lipscomb.
Yeah.
Got to be a lot of excitement out in that Austin area about that one, huh, Chris?
Yeah, big time. I think the third round NIT game might have just clipped the baseball team on a Tuesday night in terms of attendance last week.
Oh, jeez. What about Shaka Smart?
Center.
What about Shaka Smart? Is he going to be there 2019, 2020, you think?
I would be very surprised if Shaka was let go. He's got a really large buyout, quite sizable, and I don't think that's going to happen this season if it does. And I don't think this NIT run's hurting anything. I think Chris Del Conte was looking for every reason to keep him, and I wouldn't anticipate any changes on that front.
Well, one place we know there isn't going to be a coaching change anytime soon, at least not from the university side of things, is here in Tuscaloosa with the football program anyway. Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide back at it following the disappointing end to the 2018 season there in Santa Clara, the loss to Clemson. And I'm looking at your top 25 for the spring, and I think it might be a little bit of a change from the narrative that you would expect following that impressive performance by Clemson. You kind of figure the Tigers, you rubber stamp them as the number one team for the spring moving into the fall of the 2019 season. But I guess you see it a little bit differently there at the top.
Yeah, and by the way, on a job security front, I think Nick Saban's parking job at Nate Oates' press conference shows the ultimate job security. That guy just kind of laid his car out there, and it was all good. But from a football perspective, I think Alabama just brings back a little more than Clemson. And the one thing I wouldn't want to be in the SEC this season is a team that has to face an angry Alabama. And I feel like that's what you're going to get for 13 straight weeks with the Crimson Tide this year. That schedule is reasonably favorable, and I just kind of trust the talent that Alabama brings back a little bit more. That's not a disrespect to Clemson at all. They bring back a ton too, especially on offense, but it's difficult to replace the defensive line like that group had. And I think Alabama is a little more set from a roster perspective to reload at the level those two teams were playing at for most of last season.
So specifically, is there a player or two that, in your opinion right now, gives Alabama the edge over Clemson in looking at that sort of potential for another head-to-head matchup?
I don't know about one particular player. I know a healthy Tua Tagovailoa would help. I don't think he was 100% in the national title game, and I think that would certainly be an advantage. I think that defense is going to get a lot better too, especially with a couple guys coming back healthy. Terrell Lewis is going to be huge on the edge, linebacker, and that secondary is only going to get better this year, especially with a guy like Diggs returning. I know they got picked on a bit in the national title game and a bit exposed, but that secondary throughout the year was really young. And I think with another year of seasoning, especially under Coach Saban's direction with DBs being a specialty, that group's going to look quite a bit different kind of heading into next year.
Is Clemson, in your opinion, Chris, at that same level with Alabama in terms of being able to reload on an annual basis? I mean, it would seem to be that way, given that the Tigers, like Alabama, have been pretty much a constant in the college football playoff era. But yeah, when you look at the defensive front, I guess, in particular for Clemson, is that part of this program to that point where Alabama's been for quite a while now?
Well, it's going to be close. I think people are going to become quite familiar with the name Xavier Thomas very quickly. He's a five-star defensive end from the 2018 class. He played really well in limited action last year. I fully expect him to be a All-American next season. But defensive tackle is a huge question for the Tigers heading into next season. Both their projected starters have been hurt all spring. Not a single start to be found along that front. But they've recruited well. And I will say one thing about Dabo Swinney and that coaching staff. They do things a little differently. Their classes aren't always as large as some other programs. They don't have as many transfers. But what they've long proven they can do is kind of develop guys and develop them well, in much the same way Nick Saban has. So I expect that team to reload in that fashion, but maybe not just quite to the extent of Alabama, which just brought in the number one overall recruiting class in the country and has that foundation to kind of build off of from the last few years recruiting.
Chris, I see you have Georgia right there in the third spot in your spring top 25. Do you consider Georgia to be almost a 1C with Alabama 1A, Clemson 1B, maybe Georgia 1C, or do you think there's maybe a more clear delineation between Alabama, Clemson, and Georgia in that group?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go 1C. It's 2, but a really close to, maybe like 1.5 or something like that. I think Alabama and Clemson are the proven entities with coaches that have kind of proven they can win national championships and recruit consistently and kind of maintain. Kirby Smart's showing to be that on the recruiting trail. The way Georgia's recruiting is quite incredible, and they've kind of cleaned up. And I think last year's team might have been the worst that we're going to see from Kirby Smart over the next 4 or 5 years, as long as that program kind of develops their guys. So in that way, yes, but I think we have to see it on the field first. And I'm especially interested with 2 new coordinators coming out there, how the offense and the defense will look. I expect the defense will be fine, given that it's kind of Kirby's specialty. But offensively under Jim Chaney, I know there was some ruffled feathers at times around Athens. And I'll be interested to see if things kind of change up a little bit next year. Because I think that's the next step for the program, kind of that offensive push into the modern era of the game in some ways to kind of open things up a bit.
Talking with Chris Hummer, the national college football writer for 247sports.com on Southern Fried Sports, presented by Mercedes-Benz of Tuscaloosa. Now, you've got 4 SEC teams in your top 7 here. At number 6, you've got the LSU Tigers, and at number 7, you've got the Florida Gators. Let me ask you, between Florida and LSU, in terms of bust factor, the team that perhaps you've got ranked in the top 10, but has the greater potential to not finish there, which one of those 2 would you go with in terms, I guess I'm asking you about confidence level with having Florida and LSU both in the top 7 teams in the country?
I feel very good about both those programs. I would argue that LSU's ceiling is much higher. That program brings back so much, and I think people sleep on Ed Orgeron in that program a little bit. But I would actually go with LSU as the bust factor being a little bit higher, just given the schedule they have to play. In the SEC West, I think Florida's landing is a little softer in the East, given that matchup with Georgia is huge. But other than that, the conference isn't terribly strong, maybe outside of Missouri. South Carolina is a question mark, and a couple other programs could be interesting. But you feel a little bit better about Florida over the long term just because of that schedule. But in terms of a talent standpoint, LSU is a team I'd put up with anybody in the country next season. That team is going to be really, really good. It's just that schedule could get in the way of them finishing the top 10 again.
Yeah, I guess settling that debate, Chris, could come down to the matchup between the 2 teams themselves, right? I mean, they are the permanent crossover opponents there in the East and the West, and I think Florida gets Auburn this year, so that makes things a little bit tougher for the Gators, I guess.
Yeah, and that cross-divisional schedule in the SEC is always fun to examine. I idea that Georgia's going to play all these scheduled opponents that they have before they play A&M again on the road. But yeah, LSU and Florida should be really interesting this year. I would put LSU a little ahead of Florida from a talent perspective at this point. I also kind of trust what LSU has at quarterback a little bit more than Felipe Franks. But Dan Mullen's an excellent coach, and I think we saw that.
I was going to ask you about the Burrow versus Felipe Franks factor in making that prediction. I'm with you. I think I'd feel a little safer with Joe Burrow, even with the finish that Felipe Franks had to the 2018 season. Now, Chris, you do a lot of great work with the transfer portal that you can find on 247sports.com. Really a cool feature right now of the network. But I wanted to ask you, of all these players that are still in that transfer portal, Alabama just had a punter go in there a couple of days ago, Mike Bernier, who, interestingly enough, was at practice yesterday, but he is also simultaneously in the transfer portal. That's pretty interesting talent there. The one guy that's undecided right now in that transfer portal for college football that you find to be maybe the most intriguing prospect still available?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the short term, like a person who can make an impact right away, the answer is Drew Richmond, the offensive tackle from Tennessee, multi-year starter for the Vols. I know he hasn't always necessarily lived up to his recruiting billing, but he's been a really solid kind of cog on the bookends for the Vols the last few years. And there's a lot of programs out there that need offensive line help. I'm thinking of a program maybe like Florida State, where you could plug Richmond in right away and he makes a huge difference. The offensive line play is always really undervalued across college football, and few positions are more important than left tackle, especially if you can just kind of insert an experienced one. So in that way, I would consider Richmond. If we're talking long-term, I think it's Ron Tatum, a defensive line prospect from Oklahoma. Didn't get much run his first season, but his talent level is still off the charts, and he's a guy that I think, given a year or two of development, could still really turn into a All-American caliber-like player.
Chris, in keeping up with your work there at 24/7 Sports, I saw the piece that you did on Josh Gaddis, most recently the wide receivers coach here in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama, has taken over as the offensive coordinator up there at Michigan. What did you come away thinking about his situation? Is it truly a keys to the car opportunity that he has up there under Harbaugh, and just his readiness to take on that sort of role at a program like Michigan?
Yeah, I think Josh is a really interesting figure in college football this year. He's really young still. I believe he's 35, and that Michigan job's a big one. Harbaugh did give him the keys to the cars, as he likes to say. At least that's how it's been this offseason. I would say Harbaugh is doing more learning from Josh than the other way around at this point in terms of that system Coach Gaddis is trying to install. It's going to be no huddle, a little quicker tempo. It's going to be a big change for Michigan. I think Alabama fans are a little familiar with some of the work Josh did last year with the offense he and Mike Locksley helped put together. It'll look a lot like what Penn State has done under Joe Moorhead's direction. Maybe not what Mississippi State did under Joe Moorhead's direction last year, given that quarterback situation. But it'll be interesting to follow because it's a huge shift for Michigan based on what Harbaugh's done, not only at Michigan, but throughout his career when you look at the 49ers and, again, when you look at the Cardinals over at Stanford. And it'll be interesting to see if Coach Harbaugh kind of lets Josh do what he wants to do as the season goes along. Right now, that's the message. That's what's getting put out there. But Coach Harbaugh has been around football for quite a long time, and I would be very surprised to see him cede control completely on that offense to a coordinator who has never called plays before. Coach Gaddis obviously has a really strong resume, and he's worked for some of the best coaches in college football early in his career, from James Franklin to Nick Saban to Joe Moorhead to Mike Locksley. And he's had a really strong history, but that's a big first job. And Coach Gaddis says he's ready for it. He's got a lot of big ideas, and it'll be interesting to see how it's executed as Michigan goes early in the season. I think the biggest test, and we'll see it early on, is how Michigan handles the first couple weeks of a really tough schedule.
Jim likes all those tight ends, Chris, as you know. Hard to imagine Big Jim getting out of that phone booth too much. But with Shea Patterson at quarterback, this would be seem to be the time to join at least the 90s from an offensive perspective, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if necessarily know if Jim's going to have to abandon those tight ends. I think tight ends are still the strength of that roster, but it'll just be a little quicker. I think the biggest difference for them is going to be the RPOs. It's something Jim's never really run before. Kind of those read and react things that Alabama did so well, where Tua would have one player to kind of key on or one defender. And if that defender rushes, then you kind of pass to where he was going to be. Or if he comes at you, you can run at him and option it out. So that'll be a big change for Michigan. But I would argue they do have the personnel to run it, and I think tight ends are really key pieces sometimes in those systems, as we saw last year with Irv Smith and Hale. So those are players that could still factor in, and it would be nice if Jim Harbaugh turned on the color television a little bit in terms of offense. I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, forget about HD. Just get him into color, right? That's what we're working on with
Yeah.
Big Jim Harbaugh. As we let you go, Chris, we got to hit you with our question of the day. And there's a lot of passion about this topic. If you could choose just one for the rest of your life, mustard, mayonnaise, or ketchup, which one are you going with?
I honestly can't even believe this is a question. It's ketchup 110%. Like, ketchup is just so versatile. I could break this down as much as I want. You can put ketchup on chicken. You could put it on, like,
Chicken?
beef. Some people even put ketchup on fish. It's on all potato products. Like, mayo, all that other stuff can get out of here. Mayo and mustard are too limited. Ketchup's a versatile condiment that you can use all over the place.
Does it have to be Heinz 57, though? See, that's it for me. I'm picky about my brands, too. So I love ketchup. But if you're going to give me something other than Heinz, not so much, you know?
And I live in a state where they sell Whataburger ketchup in the store, and I will occasionally buy that. So no, I'm not limiting it to Heinz or Hunt's. Whataburger has the best ketchup, but any ketchup is okay to me.
All right. Well, we got that settled at least with Chris Hummer of 247sports.com. Thanks as always, Chris. We'll catch up again soon.
All right, thanks. Y'all have a good one.